Hey, is this Kenneth?
Yeah, hey Garrett, how are you?
Good, good. Thanks for giving me some of your time today.
Yeah, of course, no problem.
Well, let's just dive right into it.
Great.
I'm curious about what do you think about the juxtaposition of growing up in LA in the epicenter of noise and traffic and organized chaos and being a folk musician surrounded by all that?
Yeah, right. Interesting. Well, I guess Joey and I, we both grew up in different parts of LA. I grew up in Northeast LA. Joey grew up out on the West Side. And, I learned this after I went through college in my, as I became an adult in my 20s, is that Los Angeles can be the most lonely place on earth, despite it having, I think at last count, something like 25 million people in its metro area. But it really is the most lonely place on earth until you find your people. And I realized that after seeing a few of my college friends who came from out of state. They came to LA and never found their people and got sort of chewed up and spit out. And it occurred to me that, as weird as someone might be, you can always find somebody like you in Los Angeles, but it's not a given that you'll find them. But if you do find them, you're going to find some good company. And I feel like that actually, in some ways, is very much the story of how Joey and I met, was to be able to find a person that sort of fit my sensibilities, but also challenged me and had similar goals, but a different path. That was the most lucky thing that ever happened in my life.
Yeah.
Because who would have thought that out of 25 other million people that he and I would find each other. But so it is sort of exactly what you say, and I'd sort of like to think a little bit more about the noise that you speak of in a metaphorical sense, because there's so much of it. But somehow we found each other, and I think actually it's good old-fashioned luck. And then, of course, the last decade is, as they say, history.
Yeah. Well, do you think that folk music and acoustic music was your escape from that noise? Because I look at it as like this kind of it's such a beautiful thing to think about, the idea of a stripped down just a person with their guitar in the middle of all that,
Yeah. There was a lot of that for me. The amount of times I sat on, my parents have this beautiful home in Northeast LA that they bought, I guess, decades ago now, before it was a really fashionable area, but they have this nice little corner that sits up on top of a hill and overlooks kind of the eastern valleys of Los Angeles City. And what you just described really is that, sitting there with an acoustic guitar and playing as you look out over the city and all that's happening. Is quite the juxtaposition and is quite meaningful in that way. That was at once very influential on, I think, my writing and my sense of musicality, as specifically as the sort of table was set for Joey and I to start working together. But also at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a lot of that exists sort of with zero relation to time and place,
Yeah.
and to Los Angeles specifically. There's a sensibility and there's an interest of mine personally, and then also one of the band that is an internal journey, as one of self-reflection and self-expression, and that could have happened, I think, anywhere.
Yeah.
At a point, I've moved around the country since 2010 a few times, and I make my home in Nashville, Tennessee, which, I guess ironically, overnight at dinner, I overheard people complaining about how LA like it's getting. So maybe you're onto something. But I find that obviously where you are and who you are and the things around you inform what's going on. At the same time, there's such a big reflection of what's happening internally, specifically in I guess music as personal as this.
Yeah, well,
stripped back even.
The beauty of that with any kind of art form is that people try to think that you need to be somewhere to do something, but the originality and creativity comes from that unique perspective of where you're standing.
Yeah, that's right. But I still, and I still like how you set the table, though, because there is time and place is very important, and in many ways, these are things that none of us think about or give as much credit to as bearing influence or coming to bear on what's happening subconsciously. And it's funny because lots of times from the beginning of our band, just because I guess it's part of human experience as we're identified as a band from California. And sometimes that even flips into people trying to find trends and calling it, like California folk or something. And lots of times I read that and I go, well, that doesn't feel like me. But at the same time, it's a fact that has to be reckoned with. That's where we come from. And in some ways, they're like when we started our band, a very early publicist that we had and had the fortune of meeting, who was in Louisville, Kentucky at the time. She was sort of the one that heard our music and said, you guys really need to be like kicking around Nashville where there's this sort of budding Americana scene. And, sure enough, she was right. When we started to meet all the people here and work with all the people here, it fit so much more naturally than the circles that we were running with in Los Angeles that were a little more pop focused and a different kind of songwriting. So it's funny, whenever I read that, I kind of go, well, we were sort of more a part of this other thing than we were the LA thing. But then at the same time, we're from Los Angeles, and that can't be discounted.
Yeah. Well, not to get too far off topic, but I always think of that movie Orange County, if you remember that film.
Yeah.
And I remember as a young writer thinking I had to be somewhere or to study somewhere or whatever. But one of the things I really took away from that film was towards the end where whoever the famous writer was that he liked, he said, Orange County is your perspective. You don't even realize it,
Right.
But
totally.
But to that point, I'd read that you met Joey. The two of you met each other at, I guess, a pretty crucial crossroads when you combine forces. How at that point, though, had you thought about walking away from music before you met Joey?
Well, I think that, not to put words in his mouth, but I've heard this story enough times that I can do so confidently, is that I think Joey was very specifically at a point where he was thinking about going back to grad school for something entirely non-music related, and he was, if he wasn't less serious than me about music, he was less ambitious, and so I think that would have been plausible. He also, had all the trappings of a young adult. He had a girlfriend that was turning into a fiance, and they were kind of going through normal life paths. Whereas at the same time in my life, I had at that time moved back into my parents' house to build a music studio rather than going out and buying a house and trying to settle down and do whatever. And so for me, if I had never met Joey and my music that I'd been working on individually, if that career started to wane, I'm sure that my self-identity and self-expression would have cropped up somewhere else, either in music or in the arts. Before Joey and I, the most success I had was scoring films, and I set a little bit of that aside to write songs and to make albums. And so it's possible I would have gone back to that, or it's possible I would have fallen into something else. But I've been enough of a rule breaker since my adolescence that I doubt that you would have seen me quit.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that it would have taken on a very different shape.
Have you always been an old soul, and if so, where does that come from within you?
Well, I guess all my friends would tell me that I am, and would tell you that I am. I don't know if I've ever really identified with that designation. How do you mean it specifically?
Well, when I watch you two on stage and the interactions between each other, there's this really kind of almost vaudevillian vibe to it, where it's almost like a piece of history with that kind of persona that is largely missed in the world of performance.
Well, then, in that sense, I'll answer your question as yes, but I'll answer it in saying that and we've come by it honestly. But the whole trick about performing, you see, is it's about truth, and because an audience can smell out a fraud from a mile away. It's how the world works, and truth can take on so many different shapes, and people's tastes can if you don't like Justin Bieber, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's a disingenuous performer. It might just mean that he's not your style.
Yeah.
But to me, performing is about truth, and when you stand on stage in front of an audience of people, it's really shocking and surprising to oneself how not only they react the first time, but how that relationship develops. It's a very transformative experience. So for some people, it clams them up. For other people, it makes them blossom into public speakers. For some people, I'm sure that it's enlightening. It brings about a side of themselves that they've never known. For other people, I bet they find tasks, could be playing the guitar, that seem routine and effortless and private, that all of a sudden become cumbersome and difficult in public. But the point is that when you do it over and over, for me, the constant quest is to continue to refine that relationship in a way that feels true to self and also feels honest insofar as what you're giving to and from the audience.
Yeah.
And so this persona that's developed, I think, is actually just a function of, Joey and I are by the time we get to North Carolina here, we have about 1,000 shows under our belt together. And the way that we act on stage wasn't necessarily there the first time we did it. That was a process of discovery and a process of figuring out who we were in that space. And very much, I think it's defined by just our natural instincts as performers, and then also what has developed as our relationship between ourselves and the audience. And so I think the type of music that we play, the type of audience that we have, the type of program that we want to put on, the way that we want our songs to be listened to but not taken too seriously, but also, to have impact and to be not be undermined, all of that requires a certain setting in which to receive it. And I think the thing that you see on stage today has sort of come naturally out of all of those elements coming together.
Yeah.
And I think that when you look at it at face value, I think it resembles a little bit of how they used to do it. There's a little bit of a formality to it, but there's also a real playfulness to it. That's like, if you're comparing it to Kanye West, it's decidedly old